I'm going to tell you all a story today about the evening of October 29th, 1969. This is roughly 100 days after the moon landing, but I would argue that it's a much more important moment in human history. But before I tell you that story, I need to tell you the story of a guy named Bob Taylor. Bob Taylor worked for the United States government. He was the director of the Information Processing Techniques Office of the U.S. Army's Advanced Research Projects Agency. And he oversaw a lot of the time-sharing projects that were going on at universities at the time. So early computers were entirely batch-oriented. Right? You wrote some code, you gave that code to an operator, the operator ran the code, and then brought you your output. One of my first jobs was actually wheeling the cart with all the green bar printouts back to the developers. But by the 1960s, there was experimentation around time-sharing computers, right? So the idea behind a time-sharing computer is that instead of the computer operating in a batch mode on one program at a time, it very quickly jumps back and forth between multiple different processes that are running at the same time. And this gives the illusion to users that they can all be logged in and interacting with the computer, and they have the full attention of that computer instead of having to run it in batch mode. So if this sounds similar, essentially every multi-user operating system in the world uses this method. When you're logged into the Linux server, you don't have the full attention of that machine. It is jumping rapidly between different processes. So in his role as the director of this office, Bob was able to log in to all of these different experimental time-sharing computers around the country. And this required him to have multiple dumb terminals hardwired in his office. So there were two important things that he realized about the situation. First of all, these time-sharing computers had become, at each of the universities where they were installed, the center of a community of engineers and computer scientists. Well, computer scientists didn't exist then. Mathematicians who were interested in computing theory, and engineers. And that they were each working in isolation from one another. And if there was a way to network these time-sharing computers, then those small individual communities could be extended and expanded and let them work more quickly to share their discoveries and their work more easily. And he also realized that having all of these terminals in his office took up a lot of space. So I'll leave it up to you to decide whether this was like a visionary idea or whether he just really wanted these things out of his office. So this is Bob Taylor. Bob Taylor kicked off an effort to create a network. And that network was called ARPANET. And ARPANET allowed these systems to talk, or would allow these systems to talk to one another. So in the late 1960s, computers were not considered communication devices, not in the way that we consider them communication devices. They did math. It was essentially their role. There was some research going on into graphics and sound and human interaction. But mostly they were just designed to do math, either business math or math for the military. Making them talk to one another was not a huge priority in the computer science world. These computers were called electronic computers because they were replacing these people, mostly women, who were computers. They were human beings whose job it was to sit in a room, usually with a mechanical tabulating machine, and perform complex calculations all day long. So the earliest computers, or early computers, were built to replace these folks in the arduous process of creating ballistics tables for guns for the army, right? So if you have a gun, you need to calculate all of the different angles that you want to point the gun at to make it hit at a certain distance given certain wind conditions. And all of this had to be computed by hand in a room like this and written into a big book of tables, and then that book was sent along with the gun to where it was going to be used. And this took a lot of time and effort. So these early computers were about calculating these ballistics tables more quickly. It could take weeks or months to calculate the ballistics tables for a particular gun, whereas a computer could do it in days. Later, these computers were used to model even more complex math, the hydrogen bomb explosion. So these were really very much military assets. So communication, like I said, was not important for computers at this time. And it was a very hard problem, like packet switching, which I think we all barely even think about anymore. It's so intrinsic to networks. It was a theory. There were some academic papers written about it, but no one had ever tried to implement it. Getting two computers of the very same make and model, running the exact same software, sitting in the same room next to each other to talk to one another was nearly impossible because there were no hardware interfaces. There were no software protocols for all of this stuff. Everything that we just abstract away in our minds into the network stack didn't exist. So ARPA reached out to the tech giants of the time, and most of them weren't even interested in this project. IBM, AT&T, they didn't even bid. Some smaller companies did, and one of them won this contract. It's a company called Bolt, Beranek, and Newman. They're actually still in business. They're called BBN Technologies now. They got the contract, and they built this machine called the IMP, the Interface Message Processor. This was an implementation of those packet switching theories. They were essentially the first internet routers. And the first one was delivered to UCLA, the University of California in Los Angeles, in late August 1969. The second one was delivered about a month later to the Stanford Research Institute, also in California, about 400 kilometers away. So this is the IMP. This is the one in the back. Charlie Klein is on the left, and Bill Duvall is on the right. Now, Charlie was a grad student at UCLA. He was working under Leonard Kleinrock, who was a pioneer of computer science. And Bill Duvall was working in the Augmentation Research Center at SRI, at Stanford Research Institute, under Doug Engelbart. So if you're familiar with the history of Doug Engelbart's work in human-computer interaction, Bill Duvall was one of the members of his team. Both of them had set out to get their host machines talking to these new IMPs. So UCLA had an SDS, I'm a little bit of a computer history nerd, so forgive me. UCLA had an SDS Sigma 7 host. It was a 32-bit, it had a 32-bit CPU and 128,000 words of memory. It's a very, very powerful computer for the time. But SRI had Genie, a famous computer. It was an SDS 940. It had a 24-bit architecture, and 64,000 words, but it had 4.5 megabytes of swap. It was one of the first computers with virtual memory. It was very, very powerful, very, very powerful computer. So back to October 29th. It's about 10:30 at night, and these two programmers were ready to execute one of the most important experiments in human history. They had this primitive network, so think about it, two computers behind IMPs, so computer, router, 56 kilobit ISDN line, router, computer. And they had written software that would allow Klein to enter commands on his terminal and have those commands sent to the IMP over the ISDN line to the IMP at SRI, where they would get fed into Genies as they come from a local terminal. And then Genie's responses would be sent back to the IMP in exactly the same way. So on Genie, in order to run any meaningful commands, you first had to log into the system. And to log into the system, you had to type login. L-O-G-I-N. So imagine these two folks, they're sitting on the phone, again, 400 kilometers apart, in different computer rooms in California, and they're on the phone, and Klein types an L, and he says over the phone, "Did you get the L?" "I got the L." He types an O. "Did you get the O?" "I got the O." He types a G, and he hears over the phone, "Wait a minute, the system crashed, I'll call you back." Now, like I said, Genie was a computer that was being used in the experimental research of human-computer action. It wanted to help its users. It wanted to make interacting with it fun and easy. So when you typed in LOG, it knew that the only possible thing you could be doing in that state was typing login. So it auto-completed. And their software was not designed for the monumental task of receiving 3 characters back at the same time. But anyway, they patched the program, and a little while later, they were able to get the link working. And Charlie Klein then, that night, did something for the first time. He logged into a computer hundreds of kilometers away and worked on it. He interacted. He ran programs. He listed files in the file catalog. That's what we called them before, directories. He wouldn't be the last. Like, millions more would follow. I'm sure we all do this as part of our daily lives. That network of 2 nodes would double in size by 1969. And by the early 1980s, there were 100 nodes connected to the ARPANET. And other agencies in the United States, like NSF and like CERN in France, were beginning to adopt some of the protocols that the ARPANET had developed, things like TCP/IP. And merge these networks, the ARPANET, NSFNet, into something that we would recognize as the modern internet. In the 1990s, legislative efforts in the United States began to open up the internet to general and commercial traffic. So there were nodes across the world in Europe and Japan, but at this point the internet was very much a United States thing. It was US research universities, largely, and military computers connected together. The internet wasn't always going to be just for the academics, right? The corporations and hobbyists were going to play a big part in this. And I would say that the last half century has been as much defined by this moment in time as by any other major event, the fall of the Berlin Wall or anything. It's a reason that a lot of us are here in this room this afternoon. We've been part of this revolution that Charlie Klein and Leonard Kleinrock, Bill Duvall and Doug Engelbart and Bob Taylor and thousands of other people started. And we're the ones who are driving this forward today. And I said in the early 1990s, the internet was opened up to corporations and hobbyists. And I was one of those hobbyists. I was, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, a very active BBS user. So these were dial-up BBSs. They were often run by individuals on a personal computer. A lot of them were single line, so they were able to accept one user connected to them at a time. And if you tried and called and got a busy signal, you waited. These are really cool systems. You could use them for file sharing, for kids who were playing around with them. We played games. Some of them let you send messages to users of other systems over mail relay networks like FidoNet, right? So I used to spend hours every day dialing into BBSs. And my favorite was this Amiga file sharing BBS. I didn't have an Amiga, but their games reset like every 2 hours, so you could always log in and play Legends of Red Dragon. In 1993, the owner of that BBS set up a SCO Unixware server and got a leased line subscriber connection and started offering shell accounts for $10 a month. So you could dial in just like you did with the BBS, but instead of getting presented with a BBS menu, you were dropped to a bash prompt on this Unixware server. You were in the terminal shell. You could access Usenet. You could access FTP and IRC. It was revolutionary. So like FidoNet could get your message across the country in like maybe 2 days. Real internet email, get that message there in hours. You could Gopher to search for documents. We even had the sense at the time that we were experiencing something that we were just ahead of the curve. Like this was going to change things. And I don't want to give you the idea that I was some kind of prescient genius. I had early access to the early web via links. But it was very difficult to search. There were no real search engines. There were indexes of websites, but they often were incomplete because websites went on and offline all the time. I remember distinctly the first time I ever saw a graphical web interface. I was at a tech meetup, and one of the attendees had lugged her desktop computer to demonstrate this new offering from her ISP, slip accounts, right? So if you had dial-up internet in the late 1990s, you were using PPP, this point-to-point protocol. This was the serial line internet protocol, which was a predecessor to PPP. A large group of us were at this meetup, and we were all like huddled around this little 14-inch CRT monitor. And we watched as our friend connected to her ISP at 2,400 bits per second, which is super fast, launched the Mosaic browser. And it's funny, I can remember after all of these years, watching this low-resolution picture of a basket of purple orchids rendering on the screen, almost line by line, slowly. And I was struck by what I was witnessing and how incredibly pointless it seemed. And I thought, this is a really cool toy, but who would ever use this for anything important? It turns out a lot of people would. The internet had been a tremendously disruptive force in the world. Part of the reason for that is the way that it's grown. So this was the internet in 1969, at the end of 1969, 4 nodes. Imagine that. The entire internet expressed with 4 IP addresses. When I first got access to the internet, it looked like this. It had started to burst out of academia. By the mid-1990s, it would start to change how we were thinking about education and entertainment and commerce. Companies started seeing the commercial potential that the internet had. So the internet had been home to a lot of different subcultures. There were engineers and scientists, researchers, academic hackers. And later, folks from the BBS world started to integrate, and it was a little bit easier for us, because even though our subculture had developed completely separately from the real internet, it was also built around sharing of information. You wrote a cool program, you shared it with other people. A lot of BBSs had strict policies, where if you downloaded 100 kilobytes of data, you had to upload 100 kilobytes of data. It was all about sharing. In 1995, there were roughly 75 million people across the world that had access to the internet. By 2001, so 6 years later, that number had increased to 500 million. But as the internet population increased, the profits just never appeared. For the first time, the general population was introduced to this idea of decentralized distribution and information sharing. So things like MP3s gutted the music industry. Why would people buy CDs if they could just download music for free? And the world of journalism, the print journalism world, saw the sword hanging over their head. We survived. The internet continues to grow at an obscene pace. You can't map it geographically anymore. It's become something practical and alive. So I mentioned before, 1969, 4 IP addresses. We eventually grew to outgrow IPv4, which is a system that has billions of IP addresses. And now we're moving to IPv6 soon. IPv6 has an address space of 3.4 times 10 to the 38th power addresses. There are more potential IPv6 addresses than there are stars in the observable universe. We work with technology that is more complex than the human mind can really comprehend. You can't comprehend a number like 3.4 times 10 to the 38th power. That's a lot of zeros. There's no living person who understands in exact detail how every component inside of a cell phone works, and yet I would venture that almost everyone in this room carries a cell phone with them all day, every day. We in this room are building that future right now, and in the end, we're the ones that are going to shape what that future looks like. We're the ones that are close enough to the beast to see the warts. We know how much terrible code there is in the world, probably written some of it. We've seen the broken authentication systems, let's call them misguided attempts at cryptography. We've seen the dirty hacks and temporary fixes that have held systems together for years. And we know how badly it can go wrong. So I call myself a software engineer. I think a lot of people in this industry do. But we're a little bit different from other engineering orders. I like to think about like engineering and how software engineering as a profession. It's a very young profession. Really the first like software engineer. It's only in the like late 1960s. But other engineering professions have sort of professional orders that they often join, and one of them is the Order of the Engineer. And when they join this Order of the Engineer, this is an organization for professional engineers, so people who have this certification. They take an oath called the Ritual Calling of an Engineer, and it says, "I am an engineer. In my profession, I take deep pride. To it I owe solemn obligation. Since the Stone Age, human progress has been spurred by the engineering genius. Engineers have made usable nature's vast resources of materials and energy for humanity's benefit. Engineers have vitalized and turned to practical use the principles of science and the means of technology. Were it not for this heritage of accumulated experiences, my efforts would be feeble. As an engineer, I pledge to practice integrity and fair dealing, tolerance and respect, and to uphold devotion to the standards and dignity of my profession, conscious always that my skill carries with it the obligation to serve humanity by making best use of Earth's precious wealth. As an engineer, I shall participate in none but honest enterprises. When needed, my skill and knowledge shall be given without reservation for the public good. In the performance of duty and in fidelity to my profession, I shall give the utmost." And we don't join professional organizations, or a lot of software engineers don't join professional organizations, but this really speaks to me. It's more than that even. Like I said, from the Stone Age. We think about engineering as building bridges, building buildings, building software. But the stone axe extended the human arm. It made us stronger. It made us better hunters. It made us better butchers. It's early engineering, early technology. The domestication of plants and animals multiplied our efficiency. It let us settle, divide our labor. organized into increasingly complex societies. It's engineering, 10,000-year-old technology. For nearly all of our history, a person's thoughts died with them, but the written word gave our thoughts immortality. We can preserve the ideas of the past and learn from them in the future. With each new generation, gets to start by standing on the shoulders of all the generations that came before them. It's 4,000-year-old technology, engineering that changed the world, changed humanity. This is my hometown, former Dutch colony. So I said this is my hometown. This is New York City, or most of New York City. There's a big chunk of it down here called Queens, and a big chunk of it be roughly over here called the Bronx. But this is Brooklyn over here, and this is Manhattan. And way back in the past, these were two different cities. There was the city of Brooklyn, which was constrained right about here between the two bridges. This is the city of Brooklyn. And then there was the city of New York, which ended right about here. In 1852, an engineer named John Roebling started shopping around this idea of building a bridge. Now, he'd built bridges. He was a civil engineer, had built a lot of suspension bridges around the United States, and he believed that it was possible to build a bridge that would span the East River, this large river here, which is nearly a kilometer across. It's a large river. So in 1852, he started pushing this idea. It wasn't until 1867 that he was able to get the cities of New York and the city of Brooklyn to buy off on this idea. In 1869, construction started. Unfortunately, John Roebling died in 1869, and his son, Washington, took over the project and was working on the project as the chief engineer. So if you see the two, across the span, if you see these two towers, they were erected by building wooden rafts, essentially, and then they built the brickwork on top. So as they built the brickwork on top, it created this cavity that sank further and further down into the water until eventually it hit the bedrock underneath. And going up and down inside of these are called caissons, going up and down inside of these caused a very, very rapid change of pressure and caused a lot of people to suffer from something called caissons disease, which now, like, we think of it as a problem that divers experience, the bends, where nitrogen narcosis, I think. But back then they called it caissons disease. And Washington Roebling suffered from this coming back up from one of these caissons, and he was disabled and bedbound starting in 1969. So his wife, Emily, took over the project and taught herself catenary mathematics, calculus, material strength, taught herself how to be a civil engineer. And then, along with her husband, supervised the construction of this bridge. So they started in 1869. It took until 1883 to finish the construction of this bridge. And at the time, it was the longest cable-stayed suspension bridge in the world. It connected two cities, Brooklyn and New York. So the Statue of Liberty, which you can just barely see right over there, the Statue of Liberty contains inside of it a plaque which contains a poem called The New Colossus. And it contains a line that I find interesting. The air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame, right? The New York Harbor and the twin cities of Brooklyn and New York. So very separate identities. 1883, the Brooklyn Bridge is completed. Emily Roebling is the first person to walk across the span. And then the cable cars come, and the horse cars, and the trains. By 1898, New York, the city of New York, and the city of Brooklyn, along with Queens County, the Bronx, and Staten Island, which you can't see on the map, but you're not missing anything. Combined to become the city of Greater New York. right? So New York City is the largest city in the United States. Inside of the city boundaries, there are about 8 million people who live. The New York City metro area, which includes a big chunk of New Jersey, is home to about 20 million people. For me, born in New York City in the late 1970s, I consider myself being from New York City, even though I was born and raised in Brooklyn. So you think about this, civil engineers. A civil engineer, John Roebling, and his son and his daughter-in-law, through this idea of like applying technology, like I built this cool thing over and over and over again, and I bet I could build this cool thing over this giant river. Which I think is how a lot of people in this room maybe think. They changed the world. They created a city. The internet and the devices that we use to connect to it are becoming an extension of our own neurology. This is my partner's kids. Our daughter is younger than Facebook. Our youngest son, his goofy face here, is the same age as Snapchat. We took a road trip a while back, and the boys were 4 and 6. They're a little bit older now, but they were in the back seat. And the older one, Matthew, had an old hand-me-down cell phone. Think about that for a second. An old hand-me-down smartphone, an iPhone. And obviously it only works on Wi-Fi because he doesn't have a data plan because he was 6. And as we're driving through the countryside in sort of like rural Virginia, he would ask Google for pictures of whatever it was he was obsessed with at the time. I think crocodiles. It's like, can I see pictures of crocodiles? And he didn't understand why the phone can't answer his questions in the car. For him, the internet is not a thing that is bound up inside of computers and wires. Like it still is. Like in my mind, I think about like the internet. Well, I will go to this device and I will connect it to a network and I will go on the internet. For them, it's just a thing that exists in the air. He doesn't live in a world where the world's knowledge is at best paraphrased in an overpriced set of encyclopedias, or locked away in a library. And I'm not bemoaning this. I'm not, darn kids today, they don't remember anything. They just look on the internet. I think this is amazing. Right? I wish I'd grown up with access to this kind of information. Our children and grandchildren are growing up in a world where knowledge flows like water, and my heart really swells when I think about this. When I think about the amazing things that they're going to be able to do with it. I talked before about like standing on the shoulders of the generations that came before. They're standing on some big shoulders. The smartphone has become an embedded tool of cognition, right? It's an upgraded version of the mnemonics that we learned to memorize our times tables as children. I said before that we're the ones that are close enough to the beast. Computers are hard. I think we all know none of this stuff should be working. It's always a few moments away from breaking, and we kind of keep it together with duct tape. My first programming job was programming the scheduling software for mainframe computers. So these were still batch-oriented computers, and they could run multiple things at a time, but there were a lot of contingencies where you say, this batch job can't run until this one completes because it creates the data that this one needs to do its job. But these two jobs access the same data set at the same time, and they need write access, so they can't run at the same time. It doesn't matter which one runs first and which one runs second, but they can't contend with each other. And to do this, we had a scheduling package that had a huge database of all of these different scheduling contingencies. And we would routinely like roll this over between the different master scheduling systems. And to perform this rollover, you stop the scheduling on the primary server, you waited for it to quiesce, and then you dump the database, you send it over to this other machine using NDM, and then you loaded it into the backup scheduling system over here, and started up scheduling, and it would take over where the other one left off, right? So like we had to do this all the time. Like anytime we would take down the one for routine maintenance, we'd have to move it over. We would also move it over once a month just to validate that the other machine was working okay. So I was doing this one time, and I quiesced the scheduling system, and I logged into the other system, and I imported the database, and I turned on the scheduling system. I missed a step. I didn't dump and transfer the database over. So I brought the scheduling system up on this side on 2-week-old data. And our software was really cool. It was designed to be resilient. So it came up and said, wow, you haven't run settlement in like 2 weeks. Let me run all of that settlement for you now. It was a really bad day. It was a really, really bad day. It's been 12 years, and I still sometimes will wake up in the middle of the night in like a cold sweat having a nightmare about that. Thankfully, I didn't cause too much damage. Who remembers PlayStation Network breach in 2011? They failed to patch known exploitable vulnerabilities, which I think is number 9 on the OWASP top 10, so not like a super complex vulnerability. They were down for 25 days. They lost about 140 million euros, and that wasn't counting the PR disaster. It's hard to put a figure on that. How about the Mars Climate Orbiter? This is a little bit further back in the 90s. Some people may not remember this. So they built this space probe that was supposed to fly to Mars and go into a geostatic orbit around the poles and collect all this scientific data. And I'm going to take credit. I'm going to take credit or blame for this as a representative of the United States, because we're ridiculous sometimes. The engineers of the ground computer didn't build it to spec, right? So this is a scientific application. So of course, everything was designed to be using the metric system. But the people who wrote the software on the ground computer decided to give thrust output in pound seconds instead of Newton seconds, because what is a pound second? So the orbiter, we launched it, and it flew towards Mars, and instead of entering into this beautiful geostatic orbit around the planet Mars, it crashed into the Martian atmosphere and was incinerated. Because it turns out like being off a little bit with thrust vectors on a spaceship is bad. So that thing cost 250 million euros to build and launch, and who knows like how much scientific data. It's not like we had another one that we were going to launch right. Oh, we have a backup. It's fine. We just lost that 20 years of scientific data. How about more recent, Equifax? They're running on struts. Failed to patch a vulnerability. Got to run those patches. 145.5 million consumer history records exposed. Social security numbers, like it's our national ID number in the United States. Credit histories, credit reports. You can't put a number on this. There's no way to know the impact. This is going to affect people for decades to come. And those are just 3 examples where no one died. In the 1980s, software running the Therac 25 radiation therapy machine had a design defect. So the earlier versions of this machine used a hardware safety interlock. This machine had a high-power therapy mode and a low-power therapy mode. The low-power therapy mode sent a beam of targeted radiation at a spot. And the high-powered therapy mode used a much more powerful beam that was scattered over an area. And this machine had an interlock in that you could not switch it into high-power mode without this scattering plate moving into position. Like, it physically would not engage the high-power mode because there was a hardware interlock preventing it. But those are expensive to build. So why not just do it in software, right? Super easy. They built a software safety interlock, but there was a buffer overflow. And under certain conditions that just happened to be triggered by people typing really fast. And we don't think about this sometimes as engineers. The people who use our software get really good at using our software. So these operators, these radiation machine operators, were typing in the same sequence of commands over and over and over again every day to deliver this radiation therapy to people. So they got really, really fast at it. And if you typed in this one sequence of commands too quickly, it triggered this buffer overflow that would cause the software interlock to fail, meaning the machine would switch into high-power radiation mode, and the scattering plate would not move into position. We know at least 3 people died. There were many others injured by radiation overdose. It's a horrifying story of one of these patients who luckily survived, who jumped out of the radiation therapy machine and ran out of the room screaming. Because we have a radiation therapy machine? Who likes science fiction? That's a particle beam. 1991, during the Gulf War, the Patriot missile guidance software had a rounding error in it. Failed to track an incoming missile, struck a Marine barracks, killed 28 people, injured about 100 more. And we're not getting any better at this as an industry. We continue to release code that is riddled with bugs, vulnerabilities. At a DEF CON a couple of years ago, researchers demonstrated an exploit that let them install ransomware on a programmable thermostat. Not the Nest, it was another one, but I think the Nest looks cool, and I couldn't find a picture of that one. This is funny to think about this at first. It's like, hey, send us Bitcoin and we'll let you use your air conditioning. But this is dead serious, right? As I live in New York, sometimes people who aren't from the States don't realize how far south New York City is. It's like at the same latitude as Rome. And it gets hot. During the summer, July and August, it's not uncommon at all to have temperatures in the mid-40s. It's very hot, very humid. It's very, very oppressive heat. And temperatures like that can be deadly. So my mother lives in New York City. She's older. She doesn't handle the heat very well. And being without air conditioning on a day when it's 45 degrees outside and 95% humidity can kill. And we're getting really comfortable with having these devices in our homes, these internet-connected devices. I think it's hilarious that, like, God, we live in a world where, like, you can't turn on your lights because your router is down. The future is terrible. But these thermostats in particular, they're meant to learn our patterns, right? They're smart thermostats. They learn when we're home, when we're not, so that they can, be efficient in the use of energy to maintain the climate in our houses. But, imagine a criminal getting access to that information. And maybe people that you don't want to know your routine for when you leave the house in the morning. It's chilling. A couple of years ago, Mattel released an internet-connected Barbie doll. An internet-connected Barbie doll. An internet-connected Barbie doll. The doll contains a Wi-Fi radio, of course it does, and it comes with a companion app for an iPhone. And the idea is you connect your iPhone to the Wi-Fi network that the Barbie has, and you can control her. You can make her talk and do things. And there were vulnerabilities both in the software for the doll, and in the companion app. And if you have kids, so these vulnerabilities were not small. They allowed a person to connect to the Barbie and impersonate the app. And if you think about the idea, if you have kids, like someone having clandestine access to your children's toys and the ability to talk to them, that's terrifying. The app itself had a vulnerability that would allow it to expose client information, credential information. It's not the only toy that's had issues like this. VTech made a whole line of internet-connected educational toys. Their website had a SQL injection vulnerability, because of course it did. And attackers were able to dump about 6 million account records, including personally identifiable information about the children and their parents. So like when you think about how annoying GDPR has been, like, maybe it's not the worst thing in the world. This is, a lot of people who have diabetes, especially type 1, use internet-connected blood sugar monitors and infusion pumps, right? And these are really great for healthcare. Like you can test your blood, and it gets uploaded, and your doctor can see it and monitor your health all the time. And we're seeing more and more of these like internet-connected medical devices. But some researchers, vulnerability researchers, published a paper about how they were able to exploit experimental wireless health devices. So they had this simulator. I'll read you an excerpt. The simulator had a pacemaker, so we could speed the heart up. We could slow it down. If it had a defibrillator, which most do, we could have shocked it repeatedly. If it was the intent, we could definitely cause harm to the patient. they speculated that they could do something similar with infusion pumps, like I mentioned earlier, right? This is the kind of device that a lot of people, especially with type 1 diabetes, childhood diabetes, use to manage their insulin level. So if you don't know, insulin overdose is fatal, or can be fatal. I can imagine a government using this as a very efficient way of assassinating a person. Let's talk about the Jeep hack. So the Jeep has a Wi-Fi network in its entertainment system. Right? When it's activated for the very first time, it generates a password, right? But of course, we all know that not all random numbers are the same. And the Jeep's password that it generates is bound to the manufacture date, which means it's guessable. Right? But of course, this just gives you access to the entertainment system. An attacker can control the music player. It's funny. They can mess with the volume. They can change your radio station. And I guess they could cause some havoc, like if you're cruising down the road and like suddenly like they start blasting Metallica at full volume, that could rattle you. But also you can access the car's GPS navigation system, which means you can track its location and its movements. It's a little less funny. But naturally, the important components in the truck are isolated. So the entertainment system is not connected directly to the CAN bus, the central network inside of the car. And there's no better security, right, than an air gap. Like, there's no connection. But not all air gaps are perfect. And it turns out that while the entertainment system isn't connected to the CAN bus, it does talk to a microcontroller that's connected to the CAN bus. Now, that microcontroller is connected to the CAN bus in read-only mode, right? So you get access to that microcontroller. What can you do? Well, there's a code injection vulnerability in the firmware for the microcontroller, because of course there is, and it allows privilege escalation, which means you can switch that microcontroller into write mode, and once you get access to that controller and a writable connection to the CAN bus, you can control everything in the vehicle. Researchers were able to control the steering wheel, stop the engine, control the automatic transmission, apply and disable the brakes. They could mess with the air conditioning and the windscreen wipers. Funny. They can lock and unlock the doors. In a real attack, you can turn this car into a remote-controlled murder weapon, right? Because of bugs that we should know how to avoid and vulnerabilities that we as engineers should be on the lookout for. This was a bug. They didn't do this intentionally. What about Volkswagen? So this sounds a little bit familiar to me, maybe to some of you. Marketing said, we're going to build this car. And it's going to perform like a sports car, and it's going to have emissions that are so low, it's going to just be the most fuel-efficient, least polluting car ever. And they went to the engineers and said, hey, we had this great idea. We told everyone you're going to build it. Can you build it? And the engineers went, physics. But it didn't stop there. They got pressure from management to move forward with this. And they came up with a solution. And granted, the solution was not change the laws of physics. It was, well, let's write some software that detects when the car is connected to an emissions testing device. And then we'll run it in like really efficient mode that if you were actually driving around, you'd have really poor performance, but it'll be fine. We'll have really low emissions during the test. And then when it's not connected to the testing device, we'll switch back into like real performance mode. You get the sports car handling. So some researchers at University of Kansas were evaluating the environmental efficiency of a bunch of different cars, and they were looking at the Volkswagen TDI engine, and they said, physics. So they actually built a mobile emissions detector that they plugged into the exhaust of the car, and then they drove it on the highway, and this thing was just emitting all kinds of gases. And the story broke, and it turned out that, it came out that VW had created this defeat device. This fellow, his name is James Robert Lang. He was sentenced to 40 months in prison and fined $200,000 for his role in this. He is not the chief marketing officer of Volkswagen. He's not the CEO. He's actually not in the marketing. He was the chief engineer of the project. So if management does ask you to do something unethical, just keep in mind they're not going to be the ones going to jail. more than likely. It's not just these kind of errors and even malfeasance that are dangerous. Our capacity to collect and manage data has kept pace with the growth of the internet. I used to work on data projects. I've been working on data projects for 20-ish years, and it used to be that data sets that were a few terabytes in size were really difficult to manage. Like, you needed specialized hardware, really expensive equipment. But now, with open source tools and fairly inexpensive cloud computing resources, we can manage data sets that are in the petabytes of size. And the capacity that we have to do with this, that we have for this is pretty big. So, like, think about healthmap.org. Healthmap consumes and analyzes unstructured data, specifically news reporting. And it uses this to map outbreaks. So this was the 2017 Zika virus outbreak. This is not information that came from public health officials or the reporting of public health agencies. This data came from monitoring local reporting about the Zika virus. And it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. If you actually look at this and compare it to public health maps, it's fairly close. Or how about this? Does anybody know what this is? This is a triaxial accelerometer. In the past, these were about the size of a house cat. But today, you can build them on a single chip. A tiny chip. It's a nice big picture, but it's a tiny little chip. It's small enough to fit on your wrist, right? I wear this thing pretty much 24/7, and it generates a stream of data about how it's moving through space. Now, that data on its own is pretty useless. But if you can aggregate it, and you can analyze it for patterns, you can develop algorithms that turn that stream of data into a detailed record of my motion throughout the day. So what does this let us do? Well, you combine it with an optical heart rate monitor, and you have a dashboard with a full day's view of activity that I can share with my doctor, or I can use it just to monitor my own health. It's pretty cool. I mean, it's science fiction. It's Dr. McCoy's BioBed, except it's strapped to my wrist. I bought it on Amazon for like 120 euros with free next day shipping. So maybe the future isn't terrible. But that leaves us asking a lot of questions. Do I own that data, or does Fitbit? And if they own it, do I have any say over how they use it? In Europe, yeah. How much control do I have over my health information, right? If it lives in some cloud-based system, can I be sure that these companies are being responsible? That my data is being anonymized and protected and secured? And how can we weigh these risks against those benefits? Think about Facebook's involvement in the United States election in 2016. I don't want to think about it. I'm not going to talk about my politics. If you follow me on Twitter, you know my politics. Or it turns out also their involvement in the Leave vote, the Brexit vote in England, right? Now, this wasn't malicious. This is Facebook trying to monetize human behavior by targeting ads. Like, no one involved in this situation was trying to do anything particularly mean. They're trying to sell more Kias and tampons, and that's all they're trying to do. But it turns out that this was a bigger thing than they expected it to be. And this platform that they designed to target advertising at people may have swung very important elections. So what do we do? What does this new revolution look like? I'm standing up here, but I don't know. The technology is going to continue to grow. It's going to get more powerful. It's going to get more complex. Our ideas about privacy are changing all the time. And the corporate components of this world can either be partners or they can be enemies. I think you see this in the reaction to GDPR. Some companies were like, this is not a bad thing. Like, this forces us to prove, not just to European regulators, but to ourselves, that we're being responsible about the data that we collect on behalf of our users, that we're protecting it, that we're doing the right things. A lot of companies looked at this as an opportunity to really think hard about what are we collecting and why are we collecting it and what are we doing with it once we collect it, as a positive thing. A lot of companies, especially American companies, were like, no, we're taking our ball and going home. We're just no more European customers. We're just going to ignore this gigantic market. Forget it. So, I mean, they can be our partners or they can be our enemies. I do know that things have gotten better in a lot of ways. I think we've all seen the way that open source has transformed our industry. Think about what it was 20 years ago. When I started, everything was built in-house. Every line of code was like a closely guarded corporate secret. But over time, we've actually started to make a difference, right? We've pushed open source software into the corporate world. We've made a case, sometimes more successfully than others, that not only do broader networks of contributors make platforms better and safer, but that supporting those networks of contributors is important, right? That you need to give people time to contribute back to the open source projects that you use internally. We've taught the corporate world that open source is a lot more than just code, right? The supporting open source means supporting standards bodies. It means supporting conferences. It means supporting experimentation and innovation internally. Supporting meetups, supporting bloggers. And I'm even starting to see banks understand that they need to become part of this community to understand us if they want access to our ability and our talent. The thing is, what we do is largely magic. Anyone can learn to write code. But to be a software engineer requires a commitment to lifelong learning, to facing tough problems, to not backing down until you solve them. A software engineer has to see failure as an opportunity to learn, and success is temporary, a way station on the way to future success. So what we do is hard. We build software, and software runs the world. It will continue to run the world. So what do we do? What do we in this room do? We are going to be remembered as the grandmothers and grandfathers of the internet revolution. There is a generation of computer scientists and future software engineers in school right now, and they need heroes. So I'm going to first ask you to be the hero that they need. I assume that most of you are engineers, or that you manage engineers, or support engineers, or work in some way with engineers. You are an elite group in our industry. Most people who work in our industry will never attend a conference like this. But you're different. You cared enough to show up, and that's important. You're not content with what you know. You're driven by your curiosity and your desire to get better. So I want you to take what you learn here over the next 2 days about building better software, about protecting your users' data, about security and operations, testing, product quality, and practice it until it's second nature. Find the hard parts, the parts that your brain doesn't want to accept, and beat your head against them until you get it. Embrace the see it, do it, teach it ethic of our open source heritage and the academic and hacker cultures that gave birth to it. Share what you learn with your colleagues, with your coworkers. Find a mentor to help you. Mentor others. Share what you learn here by blogging, by speaking at a local user group. Submit to speak at conferences. When you see bugs in code, send pull requests. Demand better code reviews from your colleagues. And demand better code reviews from yourself when you're reviewing code. Break the cycle of LGTM. Set up a culture of blameless accountability where you work. Create the trust that engineers need to work, to talk openly about mistakes, to learn and grow for them. Understand that when the system fails, it's the system that failed, not any individual person. If you've built a system that is vulnerable to maybe not maliciousness, but a person not knowing everything that they need to know, or not having the information that they need to make the right decision, you built a fragile system. You don't have a bad engineer. Help your non-technical friends and relatives understand why their privacy and why their security is important and how they can protect it. Share what you learn with your family and your friends, and importantly, your representatives in government. It's really easy to be cynical about people in government, but most of them are there for good reasons. They want to make the world a better place, and they don't know anything about technology. Share what you know with them. We're standing at a pivotal moment in history. A lot has changed in the years since Charlie Klein and Bill Duvall connected the first two hosts on the internet, but that's nothing compared to the years that are going to follow. We're privileged to be the ones building that future. It's in our power to decide how our children and grandchildren will understand privacy and security, how they're going to communicate, how they're going to learn. And we're the ones building that future. The digital revolution has changed our lives, and the coming revolution may change our understanding of existence. It's very easy to lionize the achievements of people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. But they're heroes of a different world, a world that's changing really quickly, a world that we may not recognize before too long. So the big takeaway here is, in our culture of service, the heroes of our revolution are the people who serve their friends and their colleagues tirelessly, the people who worked for hours and hours to prepare their talks for this conference, the people who struggle through a problem, And when they find a solution, they write about it on a blog or ask themselves a question on Stack Overflow and then answer it. People who organize meetups and mailing lists. People who actually answer other people's questions on Stack Overflow and on IRC. Slack. It's 2018. Slack. The people who work to advance engineering culture, where they work, and where they play. The heroes of our revolution are not going to be found in boardrooms. They're going to be found in auditoriums like this. Thank you.